X-Men Days of Future Past. Good movie, right? No.
Worst movie ever!
Now there's some of you out there who might be thinking this guy is insane. X-Men Days of Future Past was a phenomenal movie. And as a standalone movie, X-Men Days of Future Past, solid enough movie. As part of the X-Men series, completely terrible because it pisses all over the entire franchise. But before we break down why X-Men Days of Future Past is not a good movie, we need to travel back in time to the year 2003 when X-Men 2, X2, the X-Men United, terrible titles, when X-Men 2 came out. The key things we need to take away from X-Men 2 is that Stryker is the bad guy. Now Stryker is the guy who basically, more or less, to cut a long story short, he's the one responsible for Wolverine being tortured and having his adamantium claws. He's the bad guy in X-Men 2 and he's trying to use Cerebro to get Charles Xavier to kill all the mutants. Ultimately, he fails, as most bad guys do in superhero movies. But at the end of the film, the X-Men are about to fly away in their airplane. Where the film is set is at a river dam, and the dam is about to burst. Jean Grey realizes this, so she goes out and she basically saves the day by protecting her friends, allowing them to escape. She basically sacrifices herself, and at the end of X-Men 2, you leave that film assuming Jean Grey is dead. Main takeaways: Stryker's the bad guy, and Jean Grey is dead. Skip forward 3 years to the year 2006, and now we've got X-Men The Last Stand, which was supposed to be the end of the X-Men series. Up to this point, most films hadn't even considered doing more than 3 films. Trilogies were all the rage, and this was supposed to finish off the X-Men series. And X-Men The Last Stand is a solid movie. It's very enjoyable. Don't forget, this before the Marvel Cinematic Universe kicked in, and we'd only had one of the Batman films so far. We hadn't had The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Rises, so we didn't know how good those Batman films were going to be. So the X-Men are still top tier superhero films. So X-Men The Last Stand, all the X-Men are upset because Jean Grey is gone. They introduced a couple of new characters, predominantly Ellen Page's character. They show that she can run through walls. A key part of the story, the government had developed a cure for mutants. They can remove their powers. So mutants can now be cured, but obviously some mutants don't like that. One of which is Magneto, who obviously assembles all the bad guys as Magneto does, and they are going to kill the person who's responsible for the cure, and they're going to stop the cure. Along the way, Mystique loses her powers. Mystique was one of the badasses of the original trilogy, and for her to lose her powers was quite shocking at the time, but it shows that the cure works, and it works quickly, and all it takes is one hit from this. They're in needles or arrows or darts. All it takes is one hit from one of these darts, power's gone. No longer an X-Men, X-Man, X-person. Then we move on to the main thing we need to take away from X-Men The Last Stand, that Jean Grey is now alive. Cyclops discovers Jean Grey alive, and ultimately she kills him off screen. Now Cyclops is dead, and Jean Grey is back alive. So eventually the other X-Men discover Jean Grey. At this point they're kind of like, how does she survive? Movies. Once they get back to the X-Men house, Xavier explains that it's her powers saved her. They basically wrapped her in a cocoon of powers. Jean Grey's alive, that's the main takeaway. He then explains that she has a split personality, one Jean Grey, one Phoenix. So Jean Grey has this evil side to her, which is clearly active now. This is the predominant person in The Last Stand. Jean Grey, long and short of it, she joins forces with Magneto. But she joins forces with Magneto after a pivotal part of the film where she kills Charles Xavier. He holds him up in the air with her powers and uses her powers to tear him apart in midair. Phenomenal scene, one of the best cinematic deaths of all time. Truly shocking because no one saw it coming at the time. Very importantly, you have to remember this for the rest of the video, Charles Xavier now dead in the X-Men series. Not just scarred or could come back to life, dead. And then at the end of X-Men The Last Stand, there's a big fight scene, and ultimately Magneto is stabbed by Beast with one of the cure darts, so Magneto loses all his powers. And then at the end, Wolverine comes face to face with Jean Grey. Her good side shows through for a second, and she asks Wolverine to kill her. It's the only way to save her. So Wolverine pulls out his claws and stabs Jean Grey. Jean Grey is dead. So now, from the X-Men Last Stand, Cyclops is dead, Jean Grey is dead, Charles Xavier is dead, Magneto's lost his powers, and Mystique has lost her powers. And that's the end of X-Men The Last Stand. More or less, we've broken down the basics there. But we need to remember all these points from these movies when we jump forward to the year 2014 when X-Men Days of Future Past comes out. Now it's all still within the same universe because they use the same actors. Beginning of the film, we see that there's these sentinels of robots. In one of the opening scenes, it's established that these sentinels are sent to exterminate mutants. They've been developed by government to eradicate all mutants, and they have special powers. They can basically absorb mutants' powers find her weakness, turn it against them, and it results in some very brutal killings at the beginning of the film from, I guess you'd say, the B team of the X-Men. We got Ice Guy and other people, and then the most important one is Ellen Page. Ellen Page brings one of the mutants into another room. She does this mind melding type of thing where she's basically sending his mind back into a younger version of himself so that they can stop the events happening. They're basically never there in the first place for the Sentinels to find them. It's basically a time travel movie, and as we saw with the Looper video, they tend to not to go well. Of course, if you haven't seen the Looper video, you definitely should, because if you still think Looper is a good movie, you've got another thing coming. Back to X-Men. Don't forget all the stuff I said about X-Men The Last Stand. The next thing that happens in Days of Future Past is a ship flies in, it lands, it's the X-Men's plane, out walks Storm, out walks Wolverine, out comes Charles Xavier, out comes Magneto. And it's very clear that Magneto has his powers, even though in X-Men The Last Stand, Xavier was killed and, to my knowledge, hasn't been brought back in any other movies. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I was just completely forgetting something there. And how did Magneto get his powers back? He lost them in X-Men The Last Stand. The movie just seems to ignore those facts. And that could happen. Thanks to Doctor Strange being Marvel, they can say this is a different timeline and that these are different events. But that can't happen because later in the film, Wolverine, or Logan, is constantly having flashbacks of Jean Grey in X-Men The Last Stand. They specifically show the clip from X-Men The Last Stand where Wolverine kills her. So if the stuff with Jean Grey happened, the stuff with Xavier also had to happen, and Magneto losing his powers also had to happen. You can't have some parts of X-Men The Last Stand be relevant and the others will just ignore those, because that doesn't make a goddamn bit of sense. Getting back to the movie, X-Men meet the B team from the X-Men. The B team basically explain about the Sentinels, and then Xavier goes into more detail about how they're created because Mystique tried to kill Peter Dinklage's character. Peter Dinklage's character is the one responsible for the Sentinels being created back in the 70s.
But killing Trask did not have the outcome she expected. It only persuaded the government of the need for his program. They captured her that day, tortured her, experimented on her. In her DNA, they discovered the secrets to her powers of transformation. It gave them the key they needed to create weapons that could adapt to any mutant power.
And they end up getting Mystique's DNA and fusing that into robots, and that's how the robots can transform. It's established that Ellen Page can send people back in time, but she says she can only send them so far. If she sends someone too far, it could tear their mind apart. But of course, Logan can heal as quickly as he can be torn apart, so he's the one they choose to send back. So Logan is sent back in time to his earlier self. Basically, his mind is transferred back into a younger version of himself. So we find Wolverine in the 70s. Now, this could have been a cool concept for one of the 457 Wolverine movies they did. So Wolverine has to go back and he has to find young Xavier and young Magneto, and he has to get them to find Mystique, to stop Mystique killing Peter Dinklage, because that's an important part in mutant history, apparently. So along the way, Logan sees a young version of Stryker, and that kind of sends him into a frenzy, and the whole thing almost falls apart. It's established that Stryker is there in the past, is important for later, and then Magneto kind of turns on him, as Magneto does. He's the main bad guy throughout all the X-Men films. So Magneto's decided he's going to kill Mystique. There's a pretty cool scene where Magneto lifts up an entire stadium and he brings that to the place where Mystique is still trying to kill Peter Dinklage. Xavier is trying to convince her not to. So when Magneto had all the bad guys exactly where he wanted them, Wolverine tried to get to Magneto to stop him. He shoots a lot of metal rods into Logan, twists them through his body. It's a pretty gruesome scene, kind of cool. And then he sends Logan off, shooting through the air, says so much for you being invincible, that type of thing. And Logan lands in a river, and because of all the metal in him, he can't get up. He's just drowning in the river, and you see his modern day version with the B team, and he's still drowning in modern day. And ultimately it ends up in a scene where Mystique saves Peter Dinklage's character and the President of the United States from Magneto in front of the eyes of the world, because all the cameras are watching, and then Xavier convinces Mystique not to shoot Peter Dinklage in front of the world. And they say that this is the moment humanity realised that mutants could be good and not evil. This is the turning point, because in the past she had killed the guy, now she doesn't kill the guy, so now the world doesn't see mutants as monsters. So while all this stuff is going on with Logan in the past, in the modern day, Sentinels are coming for the modern day X-Men. So this leads to some very brutal deaths, because the events that are about to happen in the film, obviously the filmmakers knew these events won't matter. So we can kill off characters, it can be as brutal as possible, and ultimately it won't matter. So The fans of the series will see their favourites getting murdered, but then they'll come back. Which I never like in movies. It's a cop-out, it really is. Having shock value for the sake of shock value, knowing that ultimately it doesn't matter. Scenes like in X-Men Days of Future Past, where Storm gets killed, she gets a spike through the back and she gets thrown off a cliff. And Storm is a huge character in the X-Men series. I think Halle Berry portrayed her very well. But ultimately that death, cinematic death, didn't matter. It was just ruled out because those events don't happen. These scenes also lead to some very violent deaths, including this one, which is perhaps one of the most horrific deaths in a superhero film. And ultimately all the modern day X-Men are killed one by one. The only one left alive is Ellen Page and Wolverine. Wolverine just about saves the day in the nick of time, and then those events don't happen. So Logan's been successful. Because of that, he now finds himself waking up in the modern day. Of course, events have changed because he's changed the past. And he goes downstairs, and Jean Grey is there, and so is Cyclops, who was killed in X-Men The Last Stand. So Jean Grey is back, same actors and everything. After Logan does this whole surprise thing, and we see that Rogue is back, even though Rogue left in The Last Stand. She voluntarily gave up her powers in The Last Stand. She's now back, and she's able to touch people, so she mustn't have her powers. Here's a special edition of X-Men Days of Future Past, the Rogue edition, which has more stuff about Rogue in it. Apparently it's a completely different film, but I'm not including that because we're just going with the main one they put out as the main story in the franchise. Then Wolverine speaks to Charles Xavier. Xavier then realizes it's Logan from the past. He's traveled forward now, and he's all catching up to date. Then at the end we see a scene where Logan is fished out of the river by a load of guys, one of which is Stryker, and he seems to be the commanding guy, and then they show that's actually Mystique. So now that we've all the story points out of the way, let's go through them as to why this movie doesn't make sense and therefore is not a good movie. So with Jean Grey and Cyclops being back, and the humans thinking that since the 70s the mutants aren't a threat, and the events of the first X-Men film, the second X-Men film, and X-Men The Last Stand are basically all null and void. This one movie basically eradicates the first three films, which are all good films for their day, that those events no longer happened. Then you've got the scene where Stryker's fished Wolverine out of the lake. If Stryker isn't Stryker and is actually Mystique, Stryker never did all the events on Wolverine, then Wolverine was never tortured by Stryker and ultimately given his adamantium claws. He would have been stuck with the ones he had in the 70s, like the fleshy bone. He never would have had his adamantium claws. So there's another problem. Then you kind of got what I'm going to refer to as the Looper problem, because this is a time travel film. Paradoxes are in play, and as I stated earlier, I've already shown that the stuff with Jean Grey in X-Men The Last Stand is the current timeline, so it can't be alternative timelines, so we're just stuck with time travel. And okay, it's unconventional time travel, because it's not like they're getting in a DeLorean and traveling to the past, or Bruce Willis is just magically in the past. Logan's mind is transferred into his younger version and he can control the events of the past. However, if Logan fixed the events, the X-Men and the B-Team will never be in the temple that they're in that the Sentinels go after them. So Ellen Page will never be in the position to do that mind meld on Wolverine, which ultimately sends them back and sets all the film in motion. They're never in the place to do the initial traveling back in time, and he never travels back in time and fixes it. So the problem remains until they fix it, and then ultimately it doesn't get. And I sound like a crazy person again, just like I did in the Looper video. Hopefully you get my point there, that if they fix the events, then they'll never be in the position to send someone back in time. So ultimately Logan can't fix the events in the way that he does fix the events. So yet again, X-Men Days of Future Past doesn't make sense. It's not quite on Looper's level, it's not that bad, because as I stated, the film as a standalone film, perfectly enjoyable, just doesn't make any sense. Between this film and the 457 Wolverine films, you kind of gotta say they kind of just gotta scrap all of the X-Men films and start again. And if they're going to integrate them into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which I fully expect them to do, I think they just gotta start from scratch. They just gotta get a new Wolverine, they gotta get a new Xavier, they gotta get a new everybody and go again. And that might be harsh to just drop everybody, because the series has gone on for what, 20 years, the best part of 20 years. I think the original X-Men film came out in 2000, maybe it was 2001, but as we've already stated, those films are now null and void. The events didn't happen according to Days of Future Past. But you guys let me know in the comments below if you think X-Men Days of Future Past does make sense. And if you do think it makes sense, were you not paying attention? Maybe you should skip back to the start of the video, watch it all again, pay extra attention, hit the like button and subscribe button while you're there, then go back and watch it again